My guest at this time is Pete Sepp, president of the National Taxpayers Union. It's the largest grassroots taxpayer organization in the country. And we want to get Pete's thoughts on what the exiting Republican Congress did and did not accomplish in the past 2 years, and what can reasonably be expected in the new Congress with Democrats controlling the House and Republicans still running the Senate. And Pete, thanks so much for being with us.
Always a pleasure.
Well, let's start with what got done in the previous Congress. The big one that you and I talked about many times, of course, was the tax cut and tax reform package that was passed and signed into law just over a year ago now, December of 2017. A lot of folks on the right think that's the main reason the economy has been pretty strong in the past year and why we saw larger than we previously saw in terms of GDP growth and so forth. What do you see so far as the most important outcome as a result of that legislation?
I think the most important outcome is a down payment on tax simplification. In other words, we not only had the economic growth that came from the immediate corporate tax reductions and the lower withholding of federal taxes from people's paychecks, we also saw the beginnings of a structure that will make tax compliance easier in years to come. Now, many folks were disappointed that the tax reform bill did not go further in streamlining the system, but we've got a good basis here for a start towards simplification. For example, we have what's called a version of full and immediate expensing for businesses, meaning instead of using depreciation schedules that take years, even decades, to write off the value of an investment, you can do it up front. The problem is that full and immediate expensing provision is only temporary. That's where this Congress had more work to do, and unfortunately, they didn't get that job done.
Now, Pete, when you start talking about depreciation schedules, a lot of folks know that's really important, and a lot of folks' eyes start glazing over. But what it really translates to is what business owners can focus on because of those provisions.
Yes, and equally important, you don't have to keep year after year of paperwork tracking the tax cost of your expense and taking those write-offs. You just do it up front, and you're through with it. Plus, on the individual side, this tax reform bill is going to allow tens of millions more households to use a shorter tax return. In other words, they won't have to file the 1040 with all of its associated schedules in order to take advantage of tax savings. They'll be able to use a form where they don't have to calculate all the complex deductions that normally allowed them to keep more of their own money. They'll just be able to do it in a more simple fashion. We're not going to see the dividends in terms of that simplification for a couple more years. In fact, this is going to be the first filing season coming up where people will be able to use that simpler form. I think a lot of folks are going to be surprised how much easier their taxes are going to be.
How much will folks notice not only this year, Pete, but as we get closer to what you mentioned earlier, when these temporary, meaning not permanent provisions, get closer to their expiration date? Do you think it's going to build a strong case, regardless of the complexion of Congress and even who's in the White House at that point, that they need to be made permanent?
Oh, I definitely think so. I'm sure that there are many members of the new Congress where Democrats will control the House. They're saying, well, let's take the corporate rate up a few more points. There will be pressure to do that, but of course there will be a pretty large phalanx of votes in the Senate, certainly among Republicans, perhaps even among a few Democrats who are saying, well, hold on, we just got finished trying to make our tax system more competitive with those of other industrialized nations. Let's not go backward here. And actually, there is some basis, I think, for bipartisan cooperation going forward on new types of tax cuts and tax reforms. After all, there's a very popular bipartisan bill that was part of the Tax Reform 2.0 package that would have expanded tax relief for startup businesses. You might very well be able to get that chunk of Tax Reform 2.0 in a Tax Reform 3.0 package in the upcoming Congress.
All right, Pete, let's talk briefly a little bit more about missed opportunities in the previous Congress. You mentioned that they could have made a lot of these provisions permanent, but did not. There's also, of course, the effort to repeal or at least reform the Affordable Care Act, otherwise known as Obamacare. That clearly did not happen. That's probably the biggest disappointment from a Republican perspective in this Congress. So what's the significance of not getting that one done, and what else do you see as missed opportunities from the past 2 years?
What it will probably mean is piecemeal reforms that will chip away at some of the worst elements of Obamacare. After all, this Congress and the previous Congress have delayed the implementation of a number of tax increases associated with Obamacare, and the worst ones coming up are going to affect middle-class Americans, the so-called Cadillac tax, which is going to hit employer-provided plans and union-provided health care plans very hard. That's going to pressure a lot of Democrats to rethink the Obamacare taxes that some of them might have voted on and voted for several years ago. But now that reality is going to hit their constituents right in the pocketbook, I think they're going to say, let's reconsider some of these taxes.
You think they're going to go in that direction instead of the Medicare for all?
I think very interestingly, Greg, just today, the rules package that the new House of Representatives will operate under came out, and they said that they are going to reinstitute so-called pay-go rules, where proposals to increase spending have to be paid for by offsetting tax increases or spending cuts elsewhere. Well, in the spirit of that, at least, even though there might be technicalities here, Medicare for All is a $1.3 trillion a year expenditure. Under the Democrats' own new rules, they're going to have to face the reality of huge middle-class tax hikes associated with Medicare for All. I don't think they're going to do it.
We're talking with Pete Sepp. He's president of the National Taxpayers Union. And, Pete, you mentioned that there might be some common ground with a Democratic House and a Republican Senate going forward here when it comes to tax incentives for startups. Any other possible areas of agreement?
IRS reform. The House of Representatives unanimously passed a very strong package that would restructure the IRS, institute new protections for taxpayers and audits, do wonderful things with modernizing the information technology that's been hopelessly muddled at the tax agency. The Senate just didn't get around to it this year. I think that there's bipartisan consensus to move forward on a good, solid reform package in 2019.
Lastly, Pete, as you know, this new Congress comes in under, I think, fairly unique circumstances, maybe unique ever, that there's a shutdown as the congressional transition happens. I guess it may have happened at some point. But one of the things we keep seeing here now, whether it's the Obama administration, even the later years of the George W. Bush administration, and now into the Trump administration, are really, really big deficits. The projections are that we'll be at trillion-dollar deficits again before long. Are we ever going to see, I guess is the real question, a real commitment to fiscal restraint again?
I think that commitment to fiscal restraint will have to be forced on both political parties by outside conditions. The fact is the Trump administration's trade war with China may start to take its toll on the economy this year. When that happens, when we see less economic growth, fewer tax receipts coming in, and expenditures still remaining this high, we're going to see the national debt grow to proportions that we have never witnessed in the history of this country. And that may force Congress and the president to confront a package of fiscal restraint. Otherwise, the dollar is going to plummet, borrowing for private businesses will dry up, and we will see an even worse recession.
And with the rising interest rates, the interest on the debt takes up a bigger and bigger portion of our expenditures as well. So, Pete, on that gloomy note, we'll say Happy New Year to you, and hopefully we'll have happier things to talk about as the year progresses. Thanks for your time today.
Thank you. Take care.
You too. Pete Sepp is president of the National Taxpayers Union. I'm Greg Columbus reporting for Radio America.